Every year in the state of Florida, over 7,000 people die from drug overdoses. For every homicide, there are 4 people who die from an overdose. Overdose deaths have become so common in Florida that it's no longer a big deal for somebody to die from an overdose, and thus, it's opened the possibility for some interesting scenarios. That of law enforcement considering homicides as overdoses so they don't have to investigate. In particular, this is a prevalent practice in Florida when a homeless person dies, many times under suspicious circumstances. They're labeled as overdoses because law enforcement simply doesn't care to investigate who killed a homeless person. Some of these counties that are dealing with homeless camp homicides are counties that are trying to be the safest in the entire country. Take the city of Sarasota, for example, which recently went for an entire year without a homicide. Well, just south of Sarasota city limits, there was a homicide of a man who killed a woman at a homeless camp. Recently in Bradenton, Florida, there have been a handful of homicides. I believe Bradenton has over 10 homicides this year, one of which happened to be at a homeless camp. We're starting to see that in some regions of Florida, 10-15% of the homicides, if not more, are taking place in homeless camps, which interestingly brings up the question if a county or city is trying to keep their homicide rate lower to attract people to move to that county for safety, and all of a sudden a dead person shows up at a homeless camp, it's very easy to label it simply as an overdose death because it's going to ruin their city's reputation. Without a doubt, under many circumstances today, law enforcement is just labeling these deaths as overdoses because it would really distort the analytics for their city. If people knew exactly what was happening in these homeless camps, usually homicides in the United States revolved around African American communities, but now in Southwest Florida, it's actually the white population that we're seeing most of the perpetrators come from. And on top of that, the homeless population is starting to become a focal point of homicides. This is where homeless camps are really getting a lot of heat from, is that a lot of homicides are taking place in homeless camps, and now it's no longer the African American community that dominates all the news stories about homicides, but it's actually the white population that is taking these news stories by storm in Southwest Florida. The demographics of who the perpetrator is and who the victim is have changed, and now it's no longer in African American communities that we're seeing these murders happen, but it's at the heart of the white population. On one end, white population is now dying at a rate 2 times higher than blacks from overdoses, and many of the news stories that are coming out of homicides, the person perpetrating the crime is no longer in the African American community, but in the white community, and in counties that are really trying to keep their homicide rates very low because they want the claim of the safest county in the state. This is where this is happening the most in counties, well, that are trying to give out the appearance that they're great places to live by distorting their analytics. If you've paid attention over the last 2 years, the state of Florida has quite literally stopped publishing a lot of homicide and death information that they used to in the past because there's starting to be an upward trend. It's no secret as well that right now we are in a difficult economical situation. We're starting to see poverty rates increase in cities in Florida. Again, when these analytical changes happen for the worse, simply the state and the counties and municipalities are refusing to publish this information because it's starting to shed light on Florida in a negative way. They would rather withhold this information so that the public doesn't realize what's really happening in Florida. But on today's video, we're going to get you guys stories directly from these homeless camps. We know that law enforcement in Florida has very little respect for the homeless and that the homeless people practically have no rights. But on today's video, we're going to get into some of the most horrific nightmare stories that I have heard from homeless people about things that have happened in these homeless camps. Unfortunately, many of the real-life people that are behind these stories have recently passed away. I do find it mysterious that out of hundreds of people that I've interviewed, it just happens to be those people that had those stories that are not here today. Most people in law enforcement are just doing the best they can to do their jobs like the rest of us in society. But on today's video, we're going to look at a very dark side of life in homeless camps, and it is dealing with law enforcement officers who go above due process, who purposely try to harm the homeless people. In the state of Florida, one of the biggest fears of being homeless is the notion that law enforcement now doesn't recognize you as a human being. Due process doesn't exist. And even when you are a victim of a homicide or murder, law enforcement writes it off as an overdose without investigating. Even when you call these agencies and tell them, hey, this wasn't an overdose, this was a homicide, the prosecutors and investigators don't want to hear it. They're being told by their superiors that it was an overdose, and that's the way they want it, which means that many of the people who are dying today in the state of Florida in these homeless camps are victims of homicides that will never be investigated. But in the state of Florida, it's happening not just occasionally, but on a massive scale. Laws reflect sentiments. All laws are based on a principle of a sentiment. So when the laws of a state make life difficult for a particular group of people, many of the homicides taking place in homeless camps in Florida are being mislabeled as overdoses by law enforcement, so they do not have to investigate these homicides. As we know, law enforcement in Florida is not for protecting the rights of the homeless, but of depriving them of basic rights. One of those rights is the right to have a homicide investigation once a homeless person is determined to be killed under suspicious circumstances. Unfortunately, in the state of Florida, many of the homeless people who die in these homeless camps are just being mislabeled as overdose deaths when they are really homicides. And we're not talking about one simple isolated incident. I have had people tell me in Lee County, Charlotte County, Sarasota County, Manatee County, Hillsborough County, Polk County, Brevard County, Volusia County, and Duval County that they have had suspicious situations happen in their homeless camps. When I meet the homeless people off camera, one of their biggest concerns is always the fact that they tell me that somebody was murdered in their homeless camp, but law enforcement said it was an overdose death. Many times, law enforcement in Florida is not investigating these homeless camp murders. And many things that are chilling to the bone are when I go to a particular county and different homeless people tell me the same exact story with the same exact details, confirming to me that these people are not lying, but they have in fact been victimized by law enforcement, who is now refusing to take their murders as homicides, writing them off simply as overdose deaths, leaving the people that live in these homeless camps vulnerable, since there is the notion in a few counties like Charlotte County that perhaps there is a serial person out there randomly targeting the homeless. Not only are these people victims of homicides at an alarming rate, but at the same time, when they are a victim of a homicide, many times law enforcement just chooses not to investigate these cases. Now, when I met this person, he was in complete mental anguish. I could see when I saw him that he had just experienced something very traumatic. He was sitting in a parking lot, staring blankly ahead, looking at his hands. When I first approached this person, he didn't really talk much. He was definitely having a mental episode. And he went on to tell me that recently somebody had overdosed from drugs in their homeless camp. And when the drug dealer found out that somebody had overdosed, the drug dealer came to the homeless camp and he forced the people that were living there to bury the body. By forcing the homeless people to participate in getting rid of the body, he ensured that none of the homeless people there would be able to denounce the drug dealer, since after all, they had now participated in hiding of this body. The drug dealers forced everyone in this camp to take a substance which they didn't know what it was. It was some type of drug. And then they went on to dig a hole by hand, bury the body, and then they were all complicit in the hiding of the body, which means that these homeless people would be afraid to denounce the drug dealer for what had happened, since they were forced to participate in the crime. You would think stories like this would be rare, but sadly, they're not. In fact, in another Florida county, I have heard a story about a police officer who went into a homeless camp and kicked a homeless person who was elderly on the head. That homeless person eventually succumbed to death from their injuries. And when law enforcement, the same officers, returned to the homeless camp, they labeled it as an overdose death, since they were the ones that killed this elderly person. Now that sounds like a difficult story to believe until you hear two different people in two different homeless camps in the same town tell you the same exact story and confirm the details as being identical. See, when there's an overdose or a death or a homicide in these homeless camps, the homeless people all talk to each other and they all know exactly what took place. However, rarely do these stories leave that circle. But recently, I have had homeless people urge me to get some of these stories out there because they feel that if they were killed or murdered in a homeless camp, most likely law enforcement would not investigate the case and just label it an overdose death. Recently, I met one homeless person who was a victim of a crime. Now, this person actually had the crime videotaped by a surveillance camera, and the person was arrested for the crime of battering this person. Now, this person eventually succumbed to death from the injuries that were related to the assault. Interestingly enough, I called the prosecutor and I said, hey, you do realize that this person died, and they died from the injuries that they obtained during the assault. Now, the person who committed the assault was already in a prison waiting to be sentenced. However, I don't believe that the prosecutor investigated the claim that this person died because of their injuries, and this person was going to serve as a witness for the person. Another very disturbing trend that I have seen is that the individuals who tell me these stories a month, a week, right after telling me these stories, they end up disappearing or dying themselves, which makes me believe that many times the people that have these stories of horrific abuses by law enforcement are then targeted by law enforcement, and these individuals end up dying, labeled as overdose deaths, when in reality, not only is law enforcement a suspect of the reason why the original person died, but now law enforcement is also suspectable since the person who holds that story is dying off as well. Now, both of the stories that I'm telling you are of people that have died already. These are individuals that I've met on the streets in the last few years doing my homeless camp work. They tell me these stories about how they witnessed something horrific or how they were forced to be part of something horrific against their will, many times law enforcement being involved in one way or another. And now these individuals are now gone, and their stories can never be told. And these are the horrors that are happening inside these homeless camps in Florida. Many people are disappearing, and they're the people who know the stories well. The people who were there, who witnessed these events, they're the ones that are starting to disappear as well. All of their deaths are being labeled as overdose deaths. However, it is very clear that perhaps these were retaliation murders. Many times, it's even questionable if law enforcement was involved. It is possible that literally law enforcement is actually going out there and killing some of these homeless people that have an incriminating story to tell that law enforcement may be part of. And if it wasn't for the fact that two of the people we're talking about are not here today, these people were way too young to die of natural causes. And while it is true that many of the people that I have interviewed on my channel have been passing away, probably 4 or 5 of the people that I have interviewed on my YouTube channel have died, it is interesting that about 2 of them happen to be under very suspicious circumstances, since they were somehow part of a crime where something happened, a homicide, and that homicide, law enforcement didn't want to accept the story. They're simply saying it isn't true. And throughout the state of Florida, there are countless stories like this of homeless people dying under suspicious circumstances, many times where even law enforcement is the suspect of the homicide, and yet, instead of getting an investigation, we're saying that these were overdose deaths, that these individuals who died in homeless camps did not die of any other cause other than the fact they overdosed. And while that is a common factor in these homeless camps, it is without a doubt true that at this point in the state of Florida, many of these overdose deaths have actually been homicides. Sadly, many of these homicides, the original suspect is somebody in law enforcement. In Polk County, Florida, this is the gravesite of a person who was murdered at a homeless camp. Now, we actually went into this homeless camp and we got the real story about what happened from the homeless people who live here. And the story that they told me didn't match the story that Polk County Sheriff's Office portrayed on the news. Polk County Sheriff's Office portrayed that they handle these homeless people in a respectful and dignified way. However, the stories that I heard from the homeless people that were there and witnessed the homicide and were present in this homeless camp when the whole search was going on didn't correlate. The story from Polk County Sheriff's is that they went in and they helped the homeless people where this situation happened. The real story is that shotguns were pointed inside of the homeless camps, and the homeless people were basically put on a 48-hour lockdown where they were not allowed to leave their tents while law enforcement conducted this investigation. That right there is false imprisonment, and it's a violation of the rights of the homeless people. Imagine if you're in a homeless camp, so all of a sudden a homicide takes place, and now there's a shotgun put inside of your homeless camp, and they tell you that for 48 hours you cannot leave your homeless camp. Doesn't matter if you have food, if you have water, you're just being falsely imprisoned and being held there against your will. This is what actually happened here in Polk County. The homeless people that were here were falsely imprisoned by the Polk County Sheriff's Office while they did their investigation of what happened in this homeless camp. Obviously, we know that that is not a legal method to extract information from a victim of a witnessing of a crime. However, this is a story that everybody collaborated in this homeless camp, that things were not really portrayed to the news the way they actually took place. And these stories are happening all over Florida. Lee County, Manatee County, Charlotte County, Polk County, Hillsborough County. The list goes on. And when it gets even worse, when you get over to Volusia, when you get over to Brevard and Duval County on the other coast of Florida, literally law enforcement isn't just pushing the homeless people around. They're not just taking away their basic human rights, not letting them eat at restaurants because they feel like they shouldn't be there. We're talking about situations where homicides have happened in the state of Florida, and law enforcement is many times the suspect of these homicides because of their abuses, excessively using force to bully and harass the homeless population, many times resulting in the injury of people who have health conditions, persistent on claiming that if a dealer leads to the death of somebody who's a user, that they're going to persecute that dealer as a manslaughter or a homicide. However, when law enforcement does the same exact thing, they take away somebody's rights, they hurt these homeless people, and those people succumb to the injuries that they have sustained from the abuses or excessive forces used by law enforcement in these homeless camps, that they are somehow not responsible for the same exact atrocious crime. While the stories are countless and many of these questionable at best, some of these stories are real. Some of these are real people that I have met that have told me stories about how law enforcement came in, did something that was wrong, leading to the death of somebody in a homeless camp, a death that of course is always mislabeled as an overdose. Many times people say that the homeless can just go to the Salvation Army. Little do they know that the Salvation Army charges $15 per person. I know you guys didn't really watch this video on a large scale, but a while back I did a video showing you guys the environment outside of the Salvation Army at night, where there was people bringing out weapons and they were just basically about to shoot the whole thing up. People brought weapons, guns, knives, and they were having a huge fight outside the Salvation Army in Branson. Law enforcement didn't even show up because this happens every single night outside the Salvation Army. And with the new anti-homeless law coming to Florida, these are the types of establishment where vulnerable homeless people are going to be forced to go to. You just can't put 100 homeless people in one place. Some of them are drug users. Some of them are drug dealers. Some of them are absolutely horrendous people. And the homeless would much rather risk their luck out in the woods than in a Salvation Army parking lot where they know for a fact there's going to be people there that are going to try to victimize them. Of course, nobody is going to stand up for these people. Nobody's going to tell these people stories. Nobody's going to risk their life for other people's stories to get out there. Stories of abuse, stories of exaggerated force, and stories of a people living in the United States that have absolutely no rights. What we're witnessing here with homelessness in the state of Florida right now is on par with what happened to the African American community during slavery. There were people who had no rights, were completely abused, and while everybody knew that what was happening was wrong, everybody simply looked the other way and allowed the oppressors to continue oppressing. Interestingly enough, many of these lots where the homeless camps are in Florida are in urban areas, and over the last few years, many of these lots have been cleared and new apartments have been built. New apartments over the clandestine grave sites of homeless people who disappeared under the circumstances we've talked about today. If you're living in one of these brand new apartment complexes in Florida, chances are, perhaps, that underneath your apartment complex somewhere is the clandestine tomb of somebody who disappeared many years ago in your community under questionable circumstances.